Thank you everyone for coming. I am very excited to talk about my research, which constitutes how grizzly bears use spatial memory in the Canadian Arctic. So to begin, I study animal movement modeling, which means that the data I work with is typically describing discrete time locations of an animal. So put a GPS collar on an animal and follow it around where it goes. What I'm interested in is using that data along with data about the animal's environment to infer about how the animal perceives its landscape and uses that memory to further influence where it will go in the future. This is an incredibly new field of ecology, mainly just because this data was not available technologically very long ago. Basically, we obviously know that animals will follow high quality patches in their environments, but we also know that animals only know as much as they can perceive and memorize, which is why it's important to differentiate the true conditions of the landscape from what the animal perceives. And in this subfield of ecology, we call what the animal perceives, we call that the cognitive map. That can be thought of as some imaginary structure describing where the animal thinks high quality resources or shelter are. For grizzly bears, I'm going to mostly be considering resources. And we can assume that the animal moves according to its cognitive map, not according to the true quality of the environment. So I am interested in testing these hypotheses with grizzly bears, and I've developed a model to do so. You might be asking why grizzly bears as a case study for this specific problem, because obviously a lot of animals have the cognitive complexity to use memory, but grizzly bears are a very interesting case, especially the ones in the Canadian Arctic. The population that I'm looking at specifically is located on the Mackenzie River Delta, which is up on the shores of the Arctic Ocean in the Northwest Territories. This is a very unique population of bears, mainly because it lies on the periphery of the species distribution, which is quite wide and spans a lot of different habitats. Obviously, the Arctic is a very harsh place for an animal to live, and the grizzly bears here are incredibly unique for a lot of reasons. They have to prey on a variety of unique food resources that a grizzly bear, say, in British Columbia might not have to think about. There's not any salmon up here. And it's also so cold that most of these grizzly bears spend over half of their year in the dens, so they have a much longer denning period. In other words, life is really hard for these grizzly bears, and as a result, they have to evolve and adapt to these conditions and develop some really unique foraging strategies. That's why I was quite sure that the grizzly bears in this population would exhibit memory in order to take advantage of the wide variety of food sources that they might consume. I tested this by developing a set of completely new movement models that incorporate memory as well as resource selection, because that's obviously what the bears are looking for. I evaluated the likelihood that these bears are using memory according to my hypothesis by testing a set of competing models with the one that is the most explanatory of the bear's movement patterns being the hypothesis that is most likely to be true. Specifically speaking, these four hypotheses are a null hypothesis, which is often good to have, assuming here that the animal just moves around randomly and has no ties to any part of its landscape. It just kind of goes around without any clue. We have a resource only model. Now, this is important because this is what is traditionally fit. For folks who are familiar with movement literature, this is similar to a step selection function or a resource selection function. It's basically a slightly more complicated linear regression with a set of resource covariates and assumes that the animal just goes whatever is good nearby, no memory involved. It just sort of looks for good resources nearby and goes there. We also include a model with only memory and without resources. And here, when we say memory, we assume that there is some sort of time-dependent spatial memory that the bears use to identify where is good at any given time. So you can imagine let's say it's May and the bear knows where it was last May, about a year ago, and the animal might be inclined to go back towards that area. So in our memory only model, we hypothesize that the grizzly bears are more likely to visit locations that they have visited before, and not just visited before, but visited an exact time lag before. So you can almost think of it as a cyclical movement at a specific time scale that continues on but it's not migration because it's within the animal's home range. You know, it's not a super large scale movement. Lastly, we consider a hypothesis that incorporates both resources and memory, which is what we predicted would be the most realistic explanation of the bear's movements. This model includes the resource selection component I discussed, as well as the memory component I discussed. There's also an interaction between resources and memory. And what I mean by that is we hypothesize and include in the model that the animal will only return to places that were good, basically. So if the bear visits somewhere and there weren't any resources there, it will not go back. For what it's worth, if you're interested in learning more about the modeling side of this, because I don't really have time to get into the mathematics of it, there is a preprint of a manuscript on arXiv right now that you can visit if you'd like to learn more about that. You can always contact me afterwards for more information. So to review all of that, we have a bunch of location data for 21 grizzly bears. The collars give us a GPS location every 4 hours. Most of the bears, we have 1 or 2 years of data that is eligible for model fitting. And with missing fix rates and all this stuff and denning periods, we have about 700 points for a year of bear data. We also have some environmental data describing the landscape that the grizzly bears live on, and we use this to incorporate into the resource only and resource memory models. We have our 4 hypotheses that I just discussed, and for each animal individually, we fit the model and obtain a bunch of information about the animal's movement behavior. We get BIC, which is a slight variant of AIC that's more useful in this context. And what that tells us is which hypothesis is most likely to be true. We also get parameter estimates for various model parameters that explain more about the behavior of the animals. So we can use all this data to say, are the grizzly bears incorporating memory into their movements in the way that I described? And if so, how specifically? Looking at BIC first of all, when we consider all 21 bears, you can see that the resource memory and memory only models are one of the best explanations of the bear's movement patterns in a majority of the population. However, it is personally surprising to me that there is such a high degree of individual variation. What this little pie chart is showing us is that although almost half of the bears had movements that were best explained by the resource memory model, over half of them had movements that were explained by other models. Some bears display sort of memory-only movements where they don't seem to be impacted by the resources on the landscape. Even a few were just explained by the null model, which implies that both resources and memory were not really important in determining where these animals were going. Generally, looking into the parameter estimates, there's a lot of stuff that I didn't want to go through, but the highlight was that in the bears that did use memory, we usually saw roughly a 365-day time lag or a 365-day cycle of revisitation. Remember that the hypothesis associated with our memory model was that the bears go back at a specific time. So you can imagine if it's May 2008, the bear is trying to figure out where it was in May 2007 and making its way back there. We also generally saw that the resource memory model was most explanatory for most of the bears, not all of them, which implies that that resource component is also really important. When looking at the selection parameters for the individual resources, we did see some interesting trends, which suggest to us that there might be some places to improve in terms of the accuracy of our resource-only model. So that's something that I'm currently looking into, and it might allow us to shed some more light on where these bears are going and what they're specifically looking for. One thing that I found particularly interesting was the individual variation, just because I really didn't expect any of the bears to be explained by anything other than the resource memory model. But we saw a whole lot of variation, and I could attribute this to a few things. Obviously, all of these bears are smart enough that they could theoretically incorporate memory into their movements and figure out where to go, but maybe some of them don't want to. An example might be female bears that are trying to avoid larger males, because in bears, infanticide is a very common thing. A lot of times male bears will eat young cubs, and so the females with cubs will want to stay away. these yearly changes in reproductive status might result in movement patterns that are very different from year to year. Additionally, some of our resources might depend on seasonality in some way, and that might affect our memory. Bears might use memory differently at different times of year, and since we fit the model to the entire bear GPS track at once, we wouldn't be able to get that signal. Obviously, it would be really nice to look at things on a much smaller time scale, but unfortunately, our model isn't really powerful enough to do that. It's very complex, and we would be cutting up the data into very small parts. Collecting more data would obviously be nice, but we can only work with what we have. To close up, I would just like to say thank you for listening. And I'm also very thankful for U Alberta North for setting up this event. And I'd also like to thank my co-authors, Mark Lewis, Mark Edwards, and Andrew DeRoche at the U of A. And if there's time for any questions, I'd be more than happy to do my best to answer them.